Leon Olguin here. Welcome to At Home with Music. And I hope you've been enjoying this series as we go through the history of Western classical music. And so today we're going to be talking about the era of music that kind of led us into the modern era. And we call these guys the Impressionists. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in this video.
So we've worked our way through the medieval period, the Renaissance period, the Baroque period, the classical period, the Romantic period, and now we're going to do a quick introduction into the modern period. But before we go completely modern, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Impressionists, or what is Impressionism in music. And this type of music began to appear during the late 19th and 20th centuries, and it became very popular across Western Europe, just as Impressionism was becoming popular in the visual arts. Impressionist music is more about evoking a mood, an emotion, rather than the program music of the Romantic period, which was trying to tell a specific story. The term Impressionism is taken from the painting style that began to gain influence in France during the late 1800s. It was used to describe Monet's work, such as Impression, Sunrise. So the Impressionistic composers used flowing rhythms, key changes, instrumental effects to create an impression. So from about 1890 to 1930, this style of music paved the way for what we would call the modern era. The two most important, or perhaps I should say the two most famous composers of this particular style of music were Maurice Ravel and Claude Debussy. And they both began their work in the late 19th century and on into the early 20th century. One of Debussy's most famous works, and I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the name in French, but it is a very well-known orchestral work called Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. And this was performed for the first time in 1894. And if you listen to this piece, and I will, of course, provide a link to it so that you can listen to it, it's like a musical poem. It's not highly structured like classical music, and it creates a mood. And I would be very interested if you listen to this piece. Let me know in the comments what type of mood this music creates in you. What emotions does it evoke? Debussy also wrote Impressionistic music, also introduced new types of chords and combinations. One of these pieces, and you're not really sure what key it's in, it doesn't seem to resolve in the same way that, say, a classical piece of music would. They also used exotic scales like the whole tone scale. The other famous Impressionist composer was Maurice Ravel, and he is second only to Debussy in popularity and influence. In fact, most people would rank them equally. And his most recognizable work, and once again, I will not attempt to pronounce it in French, is called Pavane for a Dead Princess. And also he wrote the famous ballet Daphnis et Chloé. Another Impressionistic composer was Sibelius. He was Finnish. He was from Finland. And I will leave links to some of his most famous works, including his pieces for piano, and also his famous piece Finlandia, which contains a very familiar melody, which was even made into a hymn called Be Still My Soul. We even have a software program named after him that I use to create musical scores. It's actually called Sibelius. One other composer that I'd like to mention is a female French composer named Lili Boulanger. She was actually the first woman to win the Prix de Rome Prize for composition, and she is Impressionists music's most eminent female composer. We will leave a link to her music. Now, as far as the instruments that were used in this style of music, mostly these are the instruments that are commonly used today. So you have stringed instruments, violins, cellos, violas. Often woodwind instruments, especially the flute, were featured in this type of music. And in fact, if you listen to Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, the famous introduction of that piece is but a solo flute. Brass instruments were kept in the background and were not really used very much. Of course, the piano was also a prominent instrument, and many compositions by Impressionist composers use the piano as a foundational instrument. So I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit more about this particular period in music history. Next, we're going to jump into the modern era, and definitely we're only going to be able to scratch the surface as we give a brief introduction. Awful lot to cover. We'll be going back to study the lives of the great composers from each era and some of their most famous works. And then eventually, we'll talk about some of the obscure composers that perhaps you have never even heard of. So thanks for watching. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. That helps the channel a lot. And please spread the word about At Home with Music.